Thank you very much, Rob. Let's take a seat over here. I'm delighted to say that we are going to continue that dialogue between civil society and academics and internet companies. And joining us in that conversation is Kate and Rob, who you've already heard speak, and Sharon Lee, who is Director of Engineering for Healthy Conversations at Twitter. How many misinformation experts does it take to pick a chair? Okay. Sharon, thank you very much for joining this conversation. We're going to start by talking to you a little bit about your work on healthy conversations at Twitter, and then bring in the rest of the panel and questions from the rest of the audience. So Sharon, you're the person, all of us care about this issue, but you're the person responsible for actually solving it at Twitter, which is a big ask. Twitter's taken quite a distinctive way of looking at this issue, whereas we've talked a lot about the negative, about how to remove misinformation and disinformation or how to challenge it. You've talked about healthy conversations. So how do you define this problem of disinformation? And what do you think are its effects?
Well, I feel like the two speakers before me actually offer a very good definition of disinformation. We use the same definition. Disinformation is false information that is deliberately created or disseminated with the express purpose of causing harm. And we do not want that on our platform.
What do you think are the consequences and the harms that you most worry about from a practical point of view in your work?
I think as an industry we're still grappling with these phenomena and the consequences. I think the first order effect is, again, like Kate mentioned in her talk, that it undermines our trust in each other, trust in our civic institutions, and our ability to accurately understand critical issues. Disinformation just muddies the waters for everybody. A second order effect, also Kate mentioned, is the notion or that disinformation is so pervasive can also create this environment of distrust, which I think environment of distrust, which may not be fully backed up by data. And an example is like the accusation that everyone is a bot, everyone you encounter on Twitter is a bot, can actually be damaging in that it's harder for us to then truly reflect on the other angle of cyber hate, for example, truly reflect on how that there may be real ugliness on how people behave online and addressing that.
Okay, so that's a fairly standard kind of view of the problem. What does healthy conversations, what's the new idea in healthy conversations? Why does that make a difference to the approach you're taking?
The definitions of healthy, it's an open dialogue at Twitter. For my interpretation and the interpretation that we're going with right now is healthy means civil, healthy means informative, healthy means I guess in some cases fun, things that that would actually delight you. It's healthy is inclusive. It's just a number of ways you can go at it. I think we're working on our internal definition, but also talking to a lot of people in the academic world to understand how we can define that for ourselves.
Great, thank you. So let's dig into the two approaches that Rob and Kate contrastingly showed to looking at data from Twitter. Rob was very granular. He was looking at individual tweets and individual responses and then scaling up that perspective. Kate was very systematic. How do you, with your responsibilities, start to get to grips with the scale of the problem and the scale of what's going right on Twitter?
Well, the scale, it's hard. You're kind of asking me about two things, the disinformation and cyber hate. They're very slightly different. Well, very different things in the way information is propagated or people are behaving in that scenario. To understand the scale, I think on the disinformation side, I'll answer that first. We have this internal project. We know that we can't fully understand the scale of it ourselves. We know that disinformation happens across platforms. We know that within each platform, it can be hard to understand, to fully understand the scale of it, because sometimes oftentimes we'll find out way after the fact. To help every one of us here understand it better, we have this project that we internally call Project Sunlight. The reason for the name is the old cliche that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And so via Project Sunlight, we've done a number of data archives releases where we release data about state-backed information operations on Twitter to the public, so that everyone can study it, everyone can understand this, help us understand the scale of it, share their insights and independent analysis with the rest of the world. I think it's the largest archive of its kind in the industry, and so far our disclosures have covered, I think, 11 countries, more than 30 million tweets, and more than 1 terabyte of data media.
Okay, that's quite the scale. So you've talked about working with or needing to liaise with other internet companies to understand this issue. You're talking about wanting to work with wider society to get a sense of what the right approach is. What are the most promising conversations you've had? What are the things you look at and see, and think these might be constructive approaches that we can take forward?
There have been a number. I guess maybe if you can clarify your question on which segment.
So we're all here to talk, to exchange ideas between different sectors, and to find things we can actually build on to move forward. Yeah. You're, I think, in a unique position in that you really understand what's feasible from your side, and a lot of people presumably want to talk to you. So I'm wondering if you feel like you've found things that look like they will be successful.
Yeah, I took copious notes in both of the previous talks. We've talked about counter-speech internally, so that's really helpful to understand the research that you've done on counter-speech, on conversation length, thread lengths. I think I've definitely learned a lot from this conversation. I think the one example that maybe I can go back to some of the things that I know that people have done with Project Sunlight. The example that Kate gave, the first case study was one. Another related to the first Sunlight disclosure was the study by Demos on Russian influence in the UK, on Twitter in the UK. And in that they found that basically there are generally 3 phases of the online operation, information operation. The first is the under the radar account building phase. The second is during the Brexit vote, they started to show up in conversations, and then last when during the London terror attacks, when they started to see a lot more vocal. The campaign started to become more vocal. So I think that's one example. Another example that I can think of is the more recent study in the New York Times about what's happening in Hong Kong and mainland China. Using the data we released, they found one account that at the beginning of last year was tweeting in English about Roger Federer and the Premier League, and it even had clickbait about Zaza, the English bulldog, I think, that won the world's ugliest dog contest. But then sometime, all of a sudden, beginning of this year, it started to tweet in Chinese about politics in Hong Kong and mainland China. And then quickly after that, over the summer, it became one of the most vocal voices that is shaping the conversation, shaping the views of the protests in Hong Kong. And so I think we ourselves feel like every time we see these research done, we are learning from that as well. So for example, in the first case, what we've done is we've doubled down our effort on sign up, on our defenses at sign up time, so that the under the radar account building activity won't happen in the first place. In the second case, we've done, we actually did a lot, this is pretty recent, but we actually done a ton of work leading up to it. We suspended 1,000 accounts that were active, 200,000 accounts that weren't already active yet, but connected. And since the release of the New York Times article, we did more research, and we found 4,000 more accounts that we then suspended. So we're constantly listening. We're here, a lot of us in the audience right now, listening, taking notes, and we'll be sharing these back with our teams when we come back.
Great, thank you. It should be said, I think, that while we all call for the internet companies to be more open and more allow more access for research, Twitter has stood out as the internet company that has made that data available for research, even when it hasn't been convenient, and that is something that you deserve credit for. You've talked about what you're learning. Let me ask you what you can teach here. As a technologist working in this area, what advice would you give to other people who are trying to tackle the problem? And there is everyone here, from some of the world's leading researchers to students entering the field.
Well, I can offer two things. The first one is, again, reiterating on some of the things that Rob and Kate mentioned. I think that specifically for disinformation, it does take place across all social media platforms, or all platforms. And we can't study it in silo in just one. I think that'll give us a very limited view of of the dynamics of that in disinformation. I think what we're looking for is more cross-platform research. What we're looking for is more collaboration. I think hopefully we'll see more of that in the future. And the second thing I'll say from the perspective of, I think, both abuse and information integrity hat, is that the user behavior on a platform can be very varied and complicated. People who use Twitter have a very different use cases, and and some of them might seem counterintuitive or spammy at a first glance, or odd. For example, most people who use Twitter in Japan have multiple accounts, and they have it for express purpose for that account. So manga or J-pop, fan, or just talk to their friends. And so it's when we work in this space, it's easy to have a hammer and see everything as a nail. So it's important to keep in mind, to remind ourselves that when we're working in this space, there is we need to build technologies that can accommodate divergent set of use cases and take into account how complicated people and their behavior on the platform is.
Great, thank you very much. It's now time to open it up to questions from the audience to everybody on the panel. So does anyone have any questions? And if not, I have plenty. I'm seeing a hand in the middle there. And any others? Okay.
Edward Wood, House of Commons Library. Kate and Sharon both talked about the societal impact, or the potential societal impact of disinformation. Is there compelling evidence that this risk has become manifest and that we have seen a decline in trust as a direct result of disinformation?
One of the things, I'm not sure that we have a way to measure that. We can see that there's a decline in trust on these measures. I think we saw that this morning in journalism, in information online. We can see the evidence of the people saying, I don't have to believe you, you're a bot. Like, people don't even trust, that their interactions are real. partially because of my research, so I have to take some credit for that, or blame. No, so we can see these things, but it's really hard to measure what are like second and third order effects of these kinds of things. It might be easier to kind of see someone might change their profile or something else, and we can measure those things. But measuring sort of the evolving erosion of trust, I think, is difficult. And in fact, there's a great argument. Thomas Ridd has been talking about this as well in his work studying sort of the history of disinformation. It's like they know that it's very hard to measure the outcomes of their campaigns, and in fact, they don't even measure them themselves because these aren't easy things to measure. But I think there would be a lot of value if we could find research methods of measuring some of these impacts, and so we wouldn't be just talking about examples or these assumptions that this is how it might work, but actually know that that's how it works.
Oh, sorry, Rob. Are you mic'd up already? Or?
Yes, I think I am, yes. Well, I'm not sure. Well, perhaps there has been a decline in trust. But I think also what's interesting is there's been a shift in whom people are prepared to trust. So the mainstream media used to be a source that people would trust, most people would trust. Now we see, I think, credibly, less people inclined to believe mainstream media, less inclined to believe scientists or...
I'm sorry, what's your source for this?
What's my source for that?
Yeah.
My source for that is the fact that you now have a lot of accounts with a lot of followers that are propagating misinformation, and people apparently are showing that they endorse that. That would be my source. That's sort of, aggregating over a number of papers and reports that I've read.
Okay, but the social survey evidence is that trust in journalism has been low for several decades. It's not a new phenomenon.
Okay, well, let's say there's a trend of falling trust in these sources.
There isn't, it's rising.
There isn't a trend.
Yeah. Trust in journalism in the UK at least has gone up in recent years.
Okay, but now on social media, people have found sources that they will then go to instead of mainstream media, and they are displaying trust in these new media sources, these new organizations that perhaps have a rather different interpretation of events that we experience. So I think it's more a shift of trust from sources, or at least where that trust has diminished. Now there are sources that people can go to where they're not satisfied with mainstream media, and with sources that would expect to command trust because they're based on evidence.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for the interesting talks. I'm trying to reconcile two slides, and please fact check me if I got them wrong. So, earlier in the morning, Rasmus I actually had the photo of the slide like this. So it was about social media helping break bubbles instead of creating them. You remember, okay? And in fact, later I asked the question, but okay, sure, more sources, but are they more diverse or is it more of the same? And he confirmed to me in another study that they found that it's more diverse, not just more sources. Now, and remember your slide where you had the Twitter graph, where essentially it was measured, if I remember, by retweets, right? It was so. I'm trying to reconcile these two views, and yes, I want to hear what you had to say.
Yeah, so there's a few things going on. There's a lot of research that suggests that this idea of filter bubbles is not exactly what's happening. So when people talk about filter bubbles of people online only seeing information from their side, and that sort of the self-selection of sources is actually not happening, that people when they go on social media and online are actually more likely to see diverse sources. What my slide showed were echo chambers, possibly, and I define echo chambers as like the information sharing within that environment. So when those people, they may be seeing, when they go to Google, they may be seeing voices from the other side, but what they're sharing and who they're retweeting stayed within those kind of echo chambers or polarized communities. And there's also some evidence that though filter bubbles may not be happening, when we see information online, we see it dressed up in a political wrapper. And even though we may be exposed to information that's different from us, we're actually predisposed to rejecting it. So my example on that is I talked to my parents who have very different political views than I do, and they told me, well, we're not just watching Fox News anymore, we're watching MSNBC as well. I said, well, I'm not sure that's going to help you, but okay, what's that experience like? Well, they were like, well, everything we see on MSNBC is clearly wrong and clearly biased, so we reject it out of hand, because they know where they're seeing it on MSNBC, and they know that they're supposed to reject it. So I think there's more complex things than just filter bubbles, and I think maybe this idea that when we see things online, it's wrapped up in either a social wrapper of someone we know or has a social identity, or in a brand of a certain kind of website that we know to reject out of hand if it doesn't align with our points of view.
Sharon, did you want to come in on that? Okay, in which case I'm going to wrap up with one last question to the whole panel. We're pushed for time, I'm afraid, but we have a break next, so do grab panelists individually. In no more than 3 sentences, if we had another conference this time next year, why will this situation be better? What will we have done differently in the next 12 months that will make this better? Who would like to start? Rob.
Well, 12 months is not a long time, I think, to expect an outcome that will improve the situation. But I think that what we are seeing, have been seeing for a number of years now, is the ways in which platforms are beginning to acknowledge that they have a significant role to play in managing the conduct of people online. And so they're entering, unwillingly, but into the space to become intermediaries. And so we are perhaps being able to return to a situation that we had before, where information news was intermediated by the companies that published newspapers and broadcast TV. Now, whatever you say about intermediation, how it doesn't allow some kinds of expression and so forth, and it does bring, closes down some kinds of talk. On the other hand, I think there's an argument that it does help to manage the negative impact where people express any opinions that they have. So re-intermediation, I think, is what's happening, and it may give us some hope for the future.
Thank you. Kate?
I think what has me hopeful are collaborations, including collaborations between the platforms and researchers, and kind of the flow of ideas back and forth, and the conversations between those to have researchers better understand what the platforms are facing, and platforms better understand what research is happening. So I think gatherings like this and other ones are contributing, and I think that's one of the things that has me hopeful, as well as the fact that platforms are starting to take responsibility. And I have met a lot of really smart, really great people who understand that these are hard problems, and they're working on them from within the platforms.
Spoken from as someone who's working on a platform, I 100% agree with Kate. I think the more of these type of conferences where we get together, we'll collaborate more with between industry and the academics, the research world, and even just sharing ideas and knowledge across different platforms. That's something we look forward to. Other things that we are actually working on, we will have better. We will hopefully roll out more types of, I guess, interventions, in a way, soft interventions in a very loose sense, on how, on what speech people, on how, like, basically on what we allow to be on a platform. So more to come.
Please join me in thanking the panel. Break, and we're back up here at 4 o'clock. Thank you.